Today I'm going to talk about body cavities. The goal of this video is to identify the major cavities and the organs inside them. First, let's talk about what a body cavity is. A body cavity is an open space filled with fluid that holds internal organs. And there are two major body cavities, the ventral cavity and the dorsal cavity. Let's talk about the ventral cavity first. I highly encourage you to pause the video and refer to the image on the right as I talk about each part of the ventral cavity. Okay, the ventral cavity is made up of two parts, an upper part and a lower part. And these two parts are physically separated by a muscular sheet called the diaphragm. The upper part of the ventral cavity is called the thoracic cavity. And within the thoracic cavity, the middle portion is called the mediastinum, and the right and left portions are called the pleural cavities. So you have a right pleural cavity and a left pleural cavity. The lower part of the ventral cavity is called the abdominopelvic cavity, and there's a top portion and a bottom portion of it. The top portion is called the abdominal cavity, and the bottom portion is called the pelvic cavity. Again, pause the video. I think it will help if you look at the picture. Now, to make it easier to locate organs within the large abdominopelvic cavity, we separate that into four parts or four quadrants. There's the right upper quadrant, the right lower quadrant, the left upper quadrant, and the left lower quadrant. Notice, based on the image here, right and left refers to the patient's right and left. Also, notice that the mid-sagittal and transverse planes pass through the navel or the belly button, and that's what creates these four quadrants. If you need a refresher on these body planes, just check out the previous video. There is another more precise way anatomists divide the abdominopelvic cavity. It ends up getting divided into 9 regions. So I'm going to go through each one of these, and I've grouped them in terms of the top row, middle row, and bottom row. So in the top row, you have the right hypochondriac region, the left hypochondriac region, and the epigastric region. In the middle row, you have the right lumbar region, the left lumbar region, and the umbilical region. And then in the bottom row, you have the right iliac region, the left iliac region, and then the hypogastric region. Notice that the right and left have the same terms in terms of each row. So the top row is hypochondriac, the middle row is lumbar, and the bottom row is iliac. All right, now let's talk about the dorsal cavity. Remember, I told you there are two major body cavities, and the dorsal was the second one. The dorsal cavity is made up of the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. The cranial cavity is the space inside the skull that contains the brain, and the vertebral cavity is the space inside the spinal column that contains the spinal cord. Before wrapping up this video, I want to identify some of the major organs in each body cavity. So I've put together this little chart for you. In the mediastinum, which was the center of the thoracic cavity, you have the heart, trachea, and esophagus. Then remember, you have the right and left pleural cavities. In those, you have the lungs. Then there's the abdominopelvic cavity, which remember has a top and a bottom part. The abdominal cavity has the liver, gallbladder, stomach, spleen, pancreas, small intestine, and parts of the large intestine. And then the bottom part of the abdominopelvic cavity, called the pelvic cavity, that's where you have the colon, rectum, urinary bladder, and reproductive organs. All of that was within the ventral cavity. That's one of the major cavities, the ventral cavity. So we'll finish the chart by talking about the other major body cavity, and that's the dorsal body cavity. Within the dorsal body cavity, you have the cranial cavity, and that contains the brain, and you have the spinal cavity, and that contains the spinal cord. I know this was a lot of new terminology, so it might help you to make some note cards to refresh your memory as you study. But to sum up, you've seen the two major body cavities, and we've identified the major organs within those body cavities.